As you may have noticed, I got my hands on a new and better recording device. So before starting the video, I would like to ask those of you who already saw any of my previous videos if they notice any major difference. Alongside with that, I would also like to know if you'd like to see a remastered version of my videos with better sound and more information. Sorry for this small deviation. Now let's get back to the dopamine injection in video format.
And that sort of thing. And we finally heard from President Macron, who was silent all day long, but he put out a tweet just in the last hour in which he said, thanks to all the law enforcement, as you'd expect. Then he said, shame on all the people who assaulted them. Shame on those who voluntarily assaulted citizens and reporters. Shame on those who tried to intimidate our elected officials. There's no space for this violence in our republic. So,
violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. A number of state and local governments have failed to take necessary action to safeguard their residents.
Right now, we're living in extremely heated times. Protests have become a common sign of the 21st century, with people taking to the streets to voice their discontent over issues ranging from economic inequality, police brutality, climate crisis, and other major systematic faults. Just recently, around 1 million French workers went to the streets due to the neoliberal reforms of the French president Emmanuel Macron. In the second half of the last year, we had experienced the biggest strikes in railway workers in the UK seen in the past 30 years, alongside with the biggest strikes organized by NHS ever made. With these protests, there are also other protests that have been happening. And don't get me wrong, these protests that I just described are by no means more important than any other protest, but they are the best to illustrate the point that I want to make in this video, of how neoliberal capitalism has subverted one of the oldest ways we had as a society of achieving social change: protests. Because while protests have been historically a way for people to demand change, they have been also become a commodity in today's capitalist society. The commodification of protests and discontent has become a lucrative business for companies looking to cash in on the latest social movement, and most importantly, a way for the system to appease those who are filled with discontent. But how exactly does the commodification of protests benefit the capitalist system? For one, it allows companies to profit off the very movement claimed to support. By publicly aligning themselves with a particular cause, companies are able to tap into a growing consumer base that values social justice and activism. They can then sell products that are marketing as supporting that cause, even if those products are produced using exploitative labor. In this way, the commodification of protests not only benefits the corporation, but also promotes the very system of exploitation and inequality that the protests aim to address. So basically, everyone wins. The companies make money, the system pretends that it's resolving the issues, and we feel good about ourselves, because we masturbated our ego by engaging in this meaningless process. But please, I can't stress this enough. At some point, it might sound that I'm a bit pessimistic, but my purpose with this video is to inform and try to educate you on systematic instruments. We should at no point stop protesting or engage in collective action. My purpose is to alert you, the viewer, to be careful not to fall in love with the revolutionary consumer trap. But let's get back to the video. So the main question is then, how did we got here? Before being a full degenerate far-left guy, the kind that eats children for breakfast and wants to commit genocide, all because his envy of the rich had worked very much to achieve what they have, while I, myself being a very lazy person, who could achieve anything only if I worked hard enough for it.
Wealth, this is according to Oxfam, of the world's 85 richest people is equal to the 3.5 billion poorest people.
It's fantastic. And this is a great thing because it inspires everybody, gets the motivation to look up to the 1% and say, I want to become one of those people. I'm going to fight hard to get up to the top. This is fantastic news, and of course I applaud it. What can be wrong with this?
Really?
Yes, really.
So somebody living on
I celebrate capitalism.
$1 a day in Africa is getting up in the morning and saying, I'm going to be Bill Gates.
That's the motivation everybody
needs.
needs.
Between me and
I'm
that
not
guy
against
is
charity.
motivation. I just need to pull up my socks.
I am not.
Wait, I don't have socks.
Look, don't tell me that you want to redistribute wealth again. That's never going to happen. Okay?
You know what? You take a simple stat like this, which is neither good nor bad. It's just a fact.
It's a celebratory stat. I'm very excited about it. I'm wonderful to see it happen. I tell kids every day, what's wrong with this?
Comes up at a cocktail party.
No, Amanda, what's wrong with this statement?
One possible response
if you
to it,
work hard, you might be stinking rich
we're talking
one day.
about people in extreme abject poverty. That's how you get $3.5 billion.
No, we're not. You were just talking about really
category.
rich people.
To associate the word protest with negative things, mainly with a white person holding some kind of silly sign or a mass and unproductive riots. In reality, I was far from being the only one with that kind of vision of protest, mainly due to the fact that we live in a system, and the system does everything in its power to maintain the status quo, to make sure it survives. It uses schools and other instruments to create a set of false beliefs about the world that tend us to accept capitalism as the end of history. In history class, in schools, during all my 7 years, the history was taught to me as a long ongoing process, alongside with national history of my country and its past elites, and how we must be proud of our past. Of course, on the first sign, this may look as a nothing or even neutral ideology, but it's clearly not. The first example implies that we are living in a pinnacle of historical evolution, that the society we involuntarily inhabit is the best one possible, that things just evolve this way, with the help of a few great individuals and ideas, which is completely neglecting all the struggle and all the efforts made by the millions who fought for a better or worse society. It paints a picture of linear progression, being us, of course, at the end of this progressive line. Rarely, if ever, we talk about the duality of power and the struggle of the unprivileged majorities through history, and how our good condition of life are a result of their fight. Because of that, in my younger years, I had a pretty bad notion of what protests are, and when YouTube started recommending me videos of so-called enraged feminists at protests, I gladly swallowed that pill and applied that vision of protest to all occurring demonstration. So now, it is funny to look back and realize that I was wrong, that from ancient times, protests and riots had a function of being instruments of social change. I will even dare to say that it's one of the oldest instruments known to mankind for internal structural change in a society, no matter the time or the space. It is the main course of action taken by an unprivileged majority in their fight against the privileged minority. They may vary in form, but they always have some sort of social change in mind. For example, in the ancient Roman Republic times, mainly during its beginning and formation as a state, we had massive riots. But most importantly, we had the so-called succession of the plebs, which was an informal exercise of power by Rome's plebeian citizen, similar in concept to a general strike. During the succession of the plebs would abandon the city in masses, in mass protests against the patrician order, and in turn, this had stunning success, because all the time we had this kind of event happening, it managed to achieve the set goal. In the end, the patrician always capitulated to the demands of the plebs, and despite this not being a normal riot or a march as we used to know in our day and age, it still was a form of protest that worked very well in that specific circumstances. Getting to a time in society more closer to us, we could look at the birth of capitalism, the dominant form of economic nowadays. Capitalism, like many other systems, was in fact preceded by revolts and massive protests. And in this case, I'm not even talking about the full-blown revolutions that implemented capitalism as the main dominant system. I'm talking about the early forms of protest and boycott made by the different cities during feudal times, which in turn resulted in bigger liberties for different cities, which greatly contributed to the establishment of them as a player in the feudal system of power. By gaining more privileges, the cities started implementing their own set of laws, and wave being that favored those who had more economical power, and in turn, could buy more power in the city's council. That created a loop, which later gave us the rise of mercantilism and the establishment of the bourgeoisie society that ended up consuming the entire world. This phenomena was much more frequent and much more common than you might think. Our schools and institutions don't teach you that, but capitalism, like many other forms of social order, was achieved mainly through struggle, riots, and above all protests. In the same manner that the new system will arise from struggle, capitalism likewise arises from struggle and class conflict. But most recently, a very interesting thing started happening. The way we protest and the way the protests are seen has drastically changed. Of course, social protests were always portrayed in a bad way by those in power, but the alteration that has been happening lately are of extreme curiosity to me. Changes that are mainly a result of the time and society that we live in, and the technology available to us. From my point of view, we first start seeing this alteration in the 60s with the protests against the Vietnam War, which practically speaking resulted in two protests, one real, on the streets, and the second one in people's television. We had one of the biggest anti-war movements in the US history happening, achieving its peak in 1969, with a march that gathered 500,000 people. But still, what was the Vietnam War anyway? Very briefly, it was a military conflict that took place from 1955 to 1975. It was fought between North Vietnam, which was supported by the Communist government of Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States and its allies. The main difference being, of course, that the US had officially declared war on Communist Vietnam in 1964. This meaning not only sending money and equipment, but also sending its official military. This war sparked widespread protests in the United States and around the world. The reason for the protests varied. Some felt that the United States had no business intervening in Vietnam's affair, while others objected to the heavy casualties suffered by American troops. But many people were opposed to the war because they believed it was unjust, immoral, and illegal. And as we now know, it was true. Not only many war crimes were committed in Vietnam by the US soldiers, but also we now know that the precedent used by the US to deploy its troops was fake. The most famous and influential protests against the Vietnam War was the moratorium to end the war, which was held on October 15 in 1969, and an estimated 2 million people participated in this event, making it one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in history. But this way of viewing the protests were not held by all the population in the US, and here enters the second part of my initial statement, the other protest, the televised one. And to be able to express my point clearly, I need to introduce a key concept, the concept of simulacra. So what is simulacra? Simulacra is kind of a term popularized by Jean Baudrillard that nobody fully understands, including me. But in this video, it will mean copies or representation of something, often with the implication that the copies are not as authentic or genuine as the original. In other words, they are copies of copies that have lost touch with any original reality. So now that we got this fancy word on the discussion table, let's talk about what happened in the protest that was being televised. Like any other war, the Vietnam War was all about profits and benefiting a very small portion of the population. So there was many people interested in making the war going, all of them in position of power, or at least with somebody representing their interest in a position of power. There were certain industries and companies that benefited from the war, particularly those involved in the military production and supply. The war required a massive amount of resources and equipment, and companies provided that goods and services to the military were able to generate significant profits. Some of the largest defense contractors during the Vietnam War included Boeing, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin. Among others, these companies produced a range of military equipment, including aircraft, weapons, and electronic systems, among other things. In addition to the defense contractors, other industries that profited from the war included the oil industry, which supplied fuel to the military, and the financial sector, which provided loans and financing for the war efforts. There's a lot that I could say about those who benefited from the war in Vietnam, but that deserves a video of its own. I will definitely do a video about how capitalism is imperial war in order to feed the expanding capital. Still, I'm running away from the point again, kind of. So, these very people, where for sake of simplicity we will call US bourgeois, were very interested in maintaining the war going, but at the same time, they felt the pressure from the population. And maybe because of that pressure, and to prevent and de-escalate the protest, they started to use the media that they owned to create a simulacra of the protest. Basically, the media transmitted the official government position, which is best described by the view of President Nixon, who publicly criticized the anti-war protests, characterizing them as unpatriotic and disloyal. Nixon famously referred to them as bums and outside agents who were working to undermine the war efforts and destabilize the country. The FBI for example, carried out covert surveillance campaign against the anti-war groups and individuals, which including wiretapping, infiltration, and other forms of intelligence gathering. The FBI counterintelligence program, known as COINTELPRO, was designed to disrupt and neutralize what the agency perceived as subversive political groups, including those opposed to the Vietnam War. While at the same time, the media was transmitting the same ideology to the moderate and unconscious part of the population, by portraying the protest as a result of Soviet and communist propaganda, influenced by an outside agent. So basically, by portraying the protest as unpatriotic and disruptive, and the result of few outsider agents who were working to compromise and destroy USA from within, being of course the majority of protest agitators who were there for chaos and violence, whose only one job was to fool the American population, which of course was as much detached from reality as it could be. Despite the claim that they were covering anti-war protests, in reality they forged a new reality, where the anti-war protests were not about simply anti-war, but an existential threat to American society. The sad part is that many Americans have adopted this simulacra and start treating it as the original. They start seeing the anti-war protests as exactly how the media had portrayed them. Being the saddest point of this, when random Americans start sending hate mail to the parents of one of the students who was killed in Kent State shooting. For those of you who don't know, this happened at the peak of the protest wave, and this specific event consisted of the US military opening fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and injuring 9. Side note time. While recording this video, a funny thing happened. Yesterday, in a place where I live, there was a big manifestation against the war in Ukraine. More precisely, EU and US sending weapons and not promoting and incentivizing peace talks. For the contrary, they keep escalating the conflict even more. The main slogan of the protest were, "We stand with the people of Ukraine, not with NATO or Russia." Today, several media reports came out, completely denigrating the protest in several ways and attributing it an ideology. And for me, for a person who knows the protest, it's funny to see that, because the protest didn't have any ideology, so the media coverage that came out doesn't correspond to reality at all. Now let's get back to the video and to the protest in the 70s. The anti-war protest was far away from being the only one that was happening at a historical period of time, but in my opinion, it's one of the best to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make in this propaganda piece. At the same time that this protest was occurring, there were another, which in many instances connected itself with the anti-war movement. Of course, I'm talking about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement suffered from the same problem as the anti-war, but even in a more hardcore way. Because the fight fought by these protesters was even more alien to people that were not connected to it. So it was way more easier for the media to demonize the protesters. But this movement was interesting from another point of view, mainly on how capitalism can absorb, transform, and later sell an anti-capitalist movement in a light that benefits the system itself. For those of you who don't know, the civil rights movement was a social and political movement that emerged in the United States in the 50s of the last century. The movement aimed to end racial segregation and discriminations against Black Americans, and to secure legal recognition and protection of their basic civil rights. And just to be clear, despite what liberals may be saying, despite very few small victories, the same problem still exists today, just with a different facade. Because the systematic oppression of the Black Americans hasn't got anywhere. As Fred Hampton said,
based on racism, when the Black Panther Party stood up and said that we don't care what anybody says, we don't think you fight fire with fire best, we think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We said we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. We stood up and said we're not going to fight reactionary pigs and reactionary state's attorneys like this and reactionary state's attorneys like Hanrahan with any other reactions on our part. We're going to fight their reactions with all of us people to get together and have an international proletarian revolution. Right on. Right on. And that's saying all power to the people. Right on. That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes.
This movement suffered from the same problem as the anti-war movement, but even more aggressively, because in the anti-war movement, there was a lot of white people directly suffering from the war, while in the second case, only the Black American minority was involved. So besides the process that I have already described in the anti-war part, the civil rights movement simulacrum got even more interesting as time passed. And before proceeding, I just want to leave a quick disclaimer here. I will not get very deeply inside the civil rights movement, because once again, it's a very important topic, a very deep topic, and it deserves a video of its own. A big distinction between the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement is the existence of very big and popular leaders and organizations and movement, like MLK, Malcolm X, and of course Frank Hampton, one of the leaders of the Black Panthers Party, openly communist, who was assassinated in his own bed by the police for his political beliefs. There were many communist and socialist activists in this movement. They understood that the oppression suffered by them had systematic roots, so without changing the system itself, it will not be possible to get rid of the racial inequality. And as time has proven, they were totally right, because even now, more than 60 years later, and the supposed win of the movement, there still exist massive discrimination problems in the US and Europe. Once again, the protesters and demonstrators were not liberals, they were progressive, with a big chunk of them being openly communist or socialist. It was precisely for that the media and the liberals demonized them as much as possible, portraying them as agitators, chaos-craving drug dealers, which of course was very removed from reality of what they truly were. They were freedom fighters who fought for a better world. During their lifetime, they were treated as demons, but then a very interesting thing happened. They were transformed into liberal martyrs. The best example of this, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr., who during his lifetime had made pretty big systematic and capitalistic critiques. And I don't know if he even was a socialist, but he was definitely not a liberal. He even criticizes the liberal media on different occasions. Despite that, the way we see him and the way he is portrayed by society has drastically changed. From a radical, he was transformed into a system-loving liberal who fought for its improvement. What was made to him was made to many others, by carefully choosing how we talk about them and showing sides of them that are not critical of the system. This mechanism was later used on different occasions. Basically, these freedom fighters were transformed into commodity in the marketplace of ideology. So far, we have seen a transformation that has occurred in a way of how protests are portrayed, which we can call the commodification of discontent. The system isolates elements from it that still contain some sort of criticism, but that are not ideologically dangerous, and then commodifies and promotes them by the creation of the simulacra of the protest and discontent, where it duplicates out of real-life discontent that is projected by the media and promoted by the state, and also by the distortion and commodification of different movement leaders in order to disarm them at an ideological level in people's eyes, or completely distort who they were, so any of their criticism of the system would be dismissed. While the first one has changed very little, the second one has had an incredible evolution, mainly after the implementation of the neoliberal society. So now, we're going to talk about the last example that I want to give, the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement was a global social and political movement that started in the United States in 2011 within the Wall Street financial district. The movement's main aim was to protest against economic inequality and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small elite, which the protesters believed was responsible for many of the world's social and economical problems, being the main catalyst for this movement the 2008 financial crisis, a crisis caused by massive greed intrinsic to capitalism. And in my personal opinion, we're still living in a crisis caused by 2008 crash. But still, let's get back to Occupy movement. The Occupy movement can be seen as a manifestation of a growing discontent with the inequalities and injustice of the capitalist system, and as a call for more just and equitable society. It was very poorly organized and with no specific action. Still, it was a very big indicator of massive society discontent within the current system. The Occupy movement can be seen as a manifestation of the growing awareness within the general population, and as a call for social and economical justice. The movement challenged the dominant narrative of neoliberalism, which advocates for deregulation, free market, and individualism, and instead emphasized the importance of collective action, community solidarity, and social responsibility. From a Marxist perspective, the Occupy movement can be seen as part of a larger struggle for socialism, which aims to transform the economic system in a way that prioritizes the needs and interests of the working class, rather than the interests of the capitalist class. Marxism sees socialism as a system that is based on democratic control of the means of production, where workers have control over their own labor, and the distribution of resources is based on needs rather than profit. And even if the general population didn't perceive this struggle and didn't connect it with the Occupy movement, it still was very important to bring this perspective back to public discussion, which resulted in a massive resurgence in this ideology and popular interest in socialism communism itself, a topic and a point of view that has been dying since the fall of USSR. But with this new arising in conscience in peoples about capitalism's massive systematic faults that are destroying humanity, we also have experienced the rise in the commodification of the protests and the popular discontent.
all those people going?
There's a protest down the street.
I think I'm gonna go check it out.
A-Train, where are you going? Almost ready to shoot.
This is important.
We gotta listen to each other. A-Train's Turbo Rush Energy Drink.
Now more than ever, we live in what Kidebo described as a society of spectacle. If you haven't read this book already, I highly recommend it. In Society of Spectacle, in the context of protest, Debord argued that the spectacle functions to co-opt and neutralize any oppositional movement or gesture. He argued that the media and other dominant institutions have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and will use their power to shape the narrative around the protest or acts of resistance in a way that reinforces their own legitimacy and authority. In this way, protests are often transformed into mere images and representation that can be consumed and manipulated by the spectacle, which is kind of exactly what we are experiencing right now, through the transformation of the protest in just another part of spectacle and a commodity, where real struggle and real fight is nothing more than what the system requires from us. In today's world, it has become more and more difficult to protest, despite the occurrence of protest itself being more and more common as time passes. In some sort of way, people are getting out to the streets more and more, mainly due to the very high price that we are paying in order to maintain the appearance that capitalism as a system is working. Now more than ever, the death of capitalism is the only way out for many people. It's a fight for survival. Being the main problem, the fact that we all live under neoliberalism and under this system, the causes of protests and the protesters themselves often struggle to gain traction, because in this society, everything is designed to marginalize and depoliticize dissent. One way in which neoliberalism can undermine protest is through the emphasis on the individualism and consumerism, where the protest and the discontent itself is transformed and branded, only to be sold later to us, not only to make profit, but to appease us. In a neoliberal society, the pursuit of personal wealth and success is often prioritized over collective action and social justice. This can lead to a situation where people are less likely to engage in a protest or other form of collective action, as they may see such action as being less relevant to their own personal interests and goals. Additionally, neoliberal policies can lead to a weakening of public institutions, including those that are responsible for regulating the markets and ensuring social welfare, which once again greatly contributes to the individualization of society. Similarly, restriction on public funding for social welfare programs or civil society organizations can limit the ability of marginalized groups to organize and mobilize around social issues. Also, it is important to mention that due to massive privatization that is occurring under the system, the protest could also be undermined by limiting access to public spaces and resources. For example, privatization of public spaces, such as parks and plazas, can make it more difficult for people to gather and express their grievance. For sure, the biggest problem still is, in my ignorant opinion, the fact that the revolution is being televised, that it is being commodified. Televising the revolution has a sedating effect on the population. not only by distorting the notion that protests are an effective instrument of change that is as old as society itself, but also by fulfilling our internal need of revolt against the capitalism oppression and alienation by transforming protest in yet another commodity that we can consume. The commodification of protest in a capitalist society is the way in which social movements and protests are co-opted and turned into commodities that are bought and sold for profit. This process involves the transformation of the political message and symbols into marketable goods and services that are later sold to the consumer. Many social and political movements are susceptible of being commodified because they often rely on media coverage and public attention to gain momentum and achieve their goals. This attention is monetized by companies and individuals who seek to profit from movements' popularity. For example, clothing companies may produce t-shirts and other merchandise featuring the slogans and symbols of protest movement, which then they sell for a profit. Additionally, the commodification of the protest can also lead to a dilution in the movement's message and purpose. As the movement becomes more and more commercialized, it can become less focused on achieving its goals and more focused on selling products and gaining media attention, massively benefiting the current system by doing so. Because after the protest becomes yet another commodity, it can be adopted by the politician, because by showing affinity with a specific cause, or in this case a commodity that represents that cause, they can rally behind its image with no systematic change in mind. Things that happen and still will happen countless times. Just pick any big protest that happened in the last 15 or 20 years, study its historiography, and see the marvelous effect of the transformation that in the end leads to absolutely no structural change. And don't get me wrong, I myself am guilty of doing that. I'm televising the revolution on a very small scale, but I still do. Me and many other creators like me who are doing it on a daily basis. I tell myself that I'm helping the cause by informing people and by creating propaganda. And it might be true, but also it might be true that in reality I'm just doing what the system wants me to do, selling you the revolution. Don't let my video demotivate you. For the contrary, my purpose with this video was to inform on how the system operates and what are the instruments used by it, so we could fight it more effectively in a system where we have no other choice, where 1% of the population lives well, while the other 99% of us are suffering, where 10,000 kids are dying every day from hunger, where 3 billion people pass through the sensation of hunger on a daily basis. Protests are more important than ever. I highly incentivize you to take part in any collective action that you can. Now, it's more important than ever. We are at the point where we need to choose what future we want, and even if we want the future. And once again, take care of yourself, your community, and thank you for watching.
Revolution is the only solution. Revolution is the only solution. Revolution is the only solution. Revolution is the solution. Revolution is the only solution.